Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you joining us today for the 10th episode of Conversation with Leaders, a LinkedIn Live series for GBS leaders and for the GBS community. I'm Rohtashu Agarwal, partner with Everest Group, lead our GBS practice. I'm joining from my home office here in London and glad to have a great panel today. And all of you joining in, do use comments to tell us where you are dialing in from. In each of the previous 9 episodes so far, we have always interacted with a GBS leader to talk about a GBS success story and bringing GBS practitioners to share how they have evolved the model, generated more value, provided better experience to their employees and stakeholders. We have heard that it has been of great value to our audience. But today, we are going to do something slightly different. I was inspired by something that Deborah Kopp said. She said that it's not easy to build a model that singularly has the power to transform the way enterprises work. So it's not easy to build a GBS. GBS leaders have to build and grow an organization, deliver excellent services, improve and transform while dealing with a lot of external factors. They deal with politics, executive stakeholders, they deal with cost pressures, they deal with, worst of all, there is sometimes just the fate working against them at times. So overall, what we will talk about today with some of the GBS leaders here is how this is not an easy task, but a programmatic and a proactive approach can help be better at it. How do you control the controllables? And this part of the story is not always discussed. So we hope to, share some really interesting best practices and insights from our panel today. Once again, I'm really glad to be hosting each of you. So welcome. We have highly experienced panel. So we have Tanuja Singhi, who heads the GBS for McCormick. We have Jay Desai, who leads the GBS for Japan Tobacco. And we have Robert, who has managed multiple GBS in the past, including Novartis, and currently is on the advisory council or board of multiple companies, including High Radius. So welcome to each of you. And I don't need to introduce you, Deborah. If somebody doesn't know you, they have a problem to start with. So with that, let me hand it over to you.
Thank you, Rohit, and welcome, Jay, Tanuja, and Robert. It's a great pleasure to be able to facilitate you today, and I promise I will be very, very, very kind. Some of you may know that a couple of months ago, I penned an article called "Another One Bites the Dust," pondering why some GBSs are sustainable through business cycles, through changes in leadership, and others just are not. So for those of you who don't like to read anymore, but rather see the film, today is the equivalent of the movie. So if you like the book, you'll love the movie today. You'll get far more color. Let me throw out my first question, which all three of you have been around the block for some time. You still look great. The first question I ask is, why do some GBS organizations thrive while others struggle to stay afloat? The $100 million question. Anyone want to take that?
Let me maybe have a first go, Deborah, if that's okay. I think if you look at the trend of GBS organizations over the last 20 years now, I think that you can really speak about a GBS industry. There's indeed been GBS organizations that have continued to accelerate to create more value for their enterprises. And there have been GBS organizations that have sort of flatlined, I would say, flatlined more. I've not actually come across many GBS organizations who have completely disappeared or dissolved. Sometimes a GBS head gets out of the picture, and sort of the concept of a GBS head is no longer there. Yes. But then still the underlying GBS framework and GBS capabilities sustain and remain. But certainly in those cases when there's a temporarily sort of no GBS had in place, even then you see the capabilities stay there, but the development of those capabilities sort of flatlines. And I think that's certainly something you can point to where you speak about which GBS teams really are successful, which are less so. I think it's really about how you are able to continue to create value, or are you flatlining? Now, what is the difference there? Why do some organizations flatline, and why are some organizations really continue to go more business specific, as I call it? Personally, I think it's got a lot to do with the entrepreneurship of the GBS team to say, do I want to become really business relevant, and do I really want to help this business deliver on their strategy? Or am I happy to stick with my accounts payable, payroll, and sort of back office processes? And am I satisfied with what I've been doing there? And that sort of drive and enthusiasm for becoming more than back office is, I think, the biggest differentiating factor between organizations that continue to thrive, continue to develop, and organizations that sort of are flatlining. And I call it entrepreneurship, or maybe intrapreneurship, if you want to call it that. I think that's a really big factor, which I see makes a difference for GBS leaders across the industry.
Well, I'd say, to your comment, I'd say that the work never goes away. The model may shift, and I've seen all of the industry struggle with justifying the model when you can still get value from a shared service, which is more or less under the control of a function. So I take your point on flatlining. I'd say that I've seen some of the capabilities go away, because only when you have a GBS model can you really afford top flight capabilities.
Yeah, but a GBS model doesn't mean you need to have a GBS head, though. The key capabilities of a GBS around business process management, around sourcing choices, around change management, those capabilities also sustain without a GBS head. If you have a GBS organization set up and maturing with a good mix of captive BPO and a good mix of BPM knowledge, I typically see those organizations keep being relevant. And I rarely have come across an organization that loses those capabilities, which I think are the key characteristic of a GBS. Once an organization have embraced those, they're really hard to get rid of, and because they're so valuable.
Jay,
Yeah,
point of view.
I was trying to figure out where to jump in here. Robert, I actually partially agree with this, right? It comes back to value, but value lies in the eye of the beholder, right? That's one. Two, if you go back to a shared service or GBS organization, it's, let's be direct, it's a little unnatural, right? Because when you first set it up, you've rocked quite a few boats. You've transformed, right? By moving things which were either in a particular function, in a particular country, into this new construct, okay? And then the value, has to be ongoing. Now, value, politics, all come together, because at one hand, when you created a GBS, you've pulled the rubber band, right? And as rubber bands go, the tendency is to come back to basically the starting point. So that tension is always going to be there, right? No matter where you are in your journey, whether you've been there 1 year, whether you've been there 5 years, or you've been there 15 years. It comes back to the value that you're unlocking, not just for yourself, but for the organization, how it basically fits into the organization's priorities. Because if you're just taking cost out, let's be real, when you moved to GBS, that was your first big bang of value. After that, the value is going to be incremental, right? So how well do you navigate through the politics, and how well you map value to what the corporation, your enterprise, is trying to do is typically critical. Because if you're on an island, I remember there was years ago, there was a GBS that was set up as a separate entity. I mean, they ran afoul and they went away, I think, literally in 5 years or less. It is a bank which is, I think, now defunct, if memory serves me correctly, right?
Because they lost their GBS, right?
No, they had some other challenges. They had some other business challenges, but they had their own agenda, which did not map with the parent bank's agenda, which is why that GBS doesn't exist. The existence stopped before the bank went belly up. That's a different conversation.
Yeah.
I mean, let's talk. Let's get a little bit more precise. I mean, the thesis I've had, and certainly Jay has, is that because it's a model, it's highly susceptible to politics. What are some of the other environmental elements that cause a GBS, as we know it, defined as multifunctional, high capability, global, etc.? You all have the definition. What are some of the other things besides politics that trip a GBS sustainability up?
I can start off on this one. Several factors, right? And I think that's where the agility of the GBS organization comes in, because there are a number of factors that need to be navigated to stay relevant. And in addition to that, I would just start off with the earlier question too. The one thing that I've seen that distinguish a thriving GBS versus somebody who struggles to stay afloat probably is really understanding the cycle of business, because that businesses go through cycles too, right? There are different needs at different points of time, and understanding those needs and the changes in them and evolving the GBS organization also to be supporting those needs. I think that becomes super relevant because businesses go through cycles also. So being in tune to the business need is, I think, one of the critical factors. Having that strong connectivity is important. Coming back to the question on hand in terms of what could be some other events that could, trip a GBS organization, there are some pretty obvious ones. One is really divestiture of any big part of the business that can oftentimes trigger, hey, if we are selling off a good piece of the company or combining with something else, a merger, it could call the GBS model in question. So any kind of corporate remodeling, if you will, mergers, acquisitions, divestitures, those are always critical points. They can either pivot to making the GBS organization even more relevant, depending on who is in that decision-making seat. Or on the other hand, you do have a risk of saying, hey, this is not working anymore. So that would be a big event that I would call out. The other one that I would say from a corporate events perspective would be major changes in the CXO organization, right? You have a leader that is completely bought into GBS. It becomes a much easier sell. You have a change happen. You have a new, a CEO, a new CFO coming in, has had some bad experiences in the past where the GBS organization didn't meet their needs. And they come in with a very strong perception around things and a very strong view. I have seen where that can be changing things overnight too, right? It has nothing to do with how well or not well the current GBS is working. It's really more about what they have been burnt with in the past. So those would be two big things that I would call out here, but my list is pretty long, so I will stop here and give my colleagues to chime in. But to me, those are the two big ones.
I think the CEO point, CEO point is a really important point, because if you look at an organization like GBS, the true value of a GBS setup is typically only seen through the eyes of a CEO who looks at the entire enterprise and says, look, this is really helpful for me to transform my company and to deliver on my strategy. And if a CEO doesn't believe that he or she needs that help, it's tough. It's a tough call. So CEO change is big. A CEO change, though, is big for many things, because typically when there's a new CEO, very quickly there's a new CFO, new CSO, CEO. These things very quickly follow as well. So CEOs do tend to have their influence on the corporate fabric, but it's probably a bigger deal. A CEO change is probably a bigger deal than an M&A, because M&A these days, when you do M&A, there's a GBS on the other side typically as well. So maybe your GBS gets absorbed by another GBS, but it's still sort of somewhere there's a GBS in that space. But the CEO is a big deal. I've seen many companies go through those changes, and gosh, there's even examples where a new CEO comes, CFO. I don't need a CHRO. I can run my company without that as well. So that it can really have a big influence.
And Robert, that's a great point. if I
Maybe
may
I'll add
ask.
one more corporate event, to this is usually if the company itself is going through some financial challenges. So if you guys recall back in the day, you would see at least maybe about 10 odd years ago, 10, 14 years ago, there's a slate of divestitures, right? Because companies needed cash back on their balance sheets. So they were basically disposing, breaking up the GBSs, disposing of the assets, and basically doing a lease back. So it also comes back to how well the company is doing, right? If you need cash, or are you willing to continue investing in it as well? So that's another big event that can upset the GBS agenda, and that's basically when the
Totally.
organization gets broken up, and then you basically go functional, or you're, otherwise some combination.
I think also one of the challenges GBS leaders, when they go into a situation, don't pay a lot of attention to is the power structure of the organization. It's much easier to sustain a GBS in a centrally where the power structure is central. But when it devolves to the business units, I mean, I always say that GBS is a creature. I think this aligns with what Robert says. GBS is a creature of the CXOs. The business generally doesn't like it. Okay, it's what the benefit accrues to the top of the house. It doesn't accrue to the business lines necessarily. They're giving up control to Jay.
Well, there's actually if I look at what I would call the best GBS organizations that I know in the world at the moment, they actually thrive in a decentralized organization where they have to compete with the external world for providing their services to the business. And there's some fantastic examples out there at the moment. And these are GBS teams they've clearly moved away from back office. I mean, back office is less than 10% of the work at the moment. And they've moved into business specific services, and they're thriving selling those services to the rest of their business colleagues in a totally a non-mandated fashion. And these are, at the moment, in my eyes at least, they are the best GBS organizations out there that are able to get to that point. It's not many, but it's a trend.
Well, yeah, look, the nice thing about the GBS world is there's an exception to absolutely every statement and every rule that we put forth. But if you think about it, what does GBS actually affect? It affects how functions run. It affects how businesses run. And the benefits really, for the most part, go to the top of the house. I think that's a huge challenge. If you look at what McKinsey calls a strategic architecture business, it's very hard when the pushes for vertical alignment. There are some challenges sustaining and growing a GBS because a vertical alignment becomes critical to the way these organizations succeed.
Yeah, and that's it. The bulk of the GBS organizations are running a mandated set of services with a cost center model. And if you have a cost center model, then absolutely the benefit just goes to the top of the house. Leading GBS organizations run a P&L model, and then the benefit goes to everybody in the business. And then these organizations are winning. They're growing fast, and they're the trend. I'm seeing more and more P&L these days. The cost center model is getting old. Is getting older.
So let me pivot. So much rests on the CXO. Whether it's the CEO, the CFO, etc. How do you know that a CXO or a member of the CXO team doesn't get GBS? We've established that this top of the house, if not mandate, but sponsorship is important. What are the signals, tangible signals you see that these guys and gals just don't get it?
Well, I can give it an attempt there, right? So it's kind of really obvious, Deb. You're making me think about putting conscious thought to it, but having lived through it, in different spaces before, you just see it. It looks you in the face. So let me give you maybe give it a little more thought. GBS stops having a seat at the table, essentially, right? I mean, to me, that becomes a big sign of the thought process, not being involved in some of those critical decision making, not having a seat at the table. That becomes one of your initial signs, if you will. There is just less prominent messaging around the importance as well as driving the usage of a GBS organization. So it's something intangible. You see it, you feel it, but it essentially translates into not having a seat at the table, or a reduced seat at the table is really how I would look at it. I think that's one of the biggest things for me, but I'd love to hear my colleagues' views on it also.
What about in effect, the demotion of GBS? You report to the CFO, and then suddenly you report to the controller or the chief administrative officer. Is that a signal that all of you have seen?
I've seen it happen for sure. The narrative that goes with it sometimes could be different because of various reasons, but it does land up diluting the effectiveness of the GBS in terms of, again, having a seat at the table, because then it goes back to, hey, you are a level below, and so you stop having that seat at that table where those discussions are happening. So that could potentially be one of the factors too that you see. Absolutely.
Jay, you're on the hot seat now. How do you know? You've worked for various CXOs, and we'll protect the innocent. What tells you that maybe they're paying lip service, but they really don't get it?
Look, it's a tough one. And I was pondering hard, about this one. I think usually I test this out when, look, we all get calls from headhunters, right? And usually this is my litmus test. Like, I'd be very candid, right? I took the role here. I asked the same question to the entire same question to the entire C-suite to basically make sure that, I would get consistent answers. And I did. So usually the questions that I ask are along, their commitment. How committed are you to the cause? And how much are you willing to invest in basically making this dream come true? And usually the answers to these two questions will give you a pretty good sense, of how committed they are. Because, I'm sure everybody's gotten those calls where there is but we are a finance shared services and we want to grow here. And the next question you ask is, where's the commitment? Who's sponsoring it? Who's basically driving it? Are the management team aligned? Right? Do you have a consultant helping you with it? As much as we don't, always like consultants, but that means commitment.
They demonstrate commitment. If someone's paying for a consultant, by golly, they're demonstrating some
we
level.
will pay for consultants, but you're willing to pay, which means you're committed, right? Versus, somebody's personal dream that I want to build this organization up. Usually I do this, personally, I do this as part of the due diligence, cycle. I do the same thing in my prior job as well. It's not just, the words, but where is the action behind those words, right? There's a commitment, investment. How serious are you?
I think there's, in addition to those points, which I fully subscribe to, I think there's one other important tell of a CXO who doesn't get GBS, namely a GBS leader who doesn't get the business. If a GBS leader isn't passionate about the business,
yes,
that's an immediate lead indicator to the executive team not to be interested in the GBS leader, right? And that's something I think all GBS leaders who are maybe watching this should think about, because it is a key success factor.
If you think about it, we drink our own Kool-Aid in this industry. We have a very firm vision about what maturity should look like, courtesy of some of those consultants. We have our own vision of success may not be the vision of the business. So I guess the question I'd ask you, a follow-on question, is why do GBS leaders chase goals that are different from the enterprise? Why don't they get the business, Robert? You've made that statement. Why don't they get it?
I think the beauty and sort of the trickiness of people that work in GBS is the passion about the process, the passion about the function they're working on, the passion about I'm really good in managing my service, which translates itself into being absolute functional experts and being able to come up with a great amount of KPIs and SLAs demonstrating how well you're running your process. But at the end of the day, that is not what's going to make the difference for the business to be successful in the market. It's relevant, it's important to make the company tick, but being successful in the market is a different matter. And I see too many GBS leaders at multiple levels who are so passionate about the work they do, the job they do. They're so professional, so sort of endeared to it, that they forget that actually their business is about whatever that business is about, and they really need to be passionate about the business more so than the function and the specific job that they're a part of.
Well, maybe they should be service providers. If you think
well,
about
yeah, but service
providers.
For me, the big downside of service providers and most BPOs is they really don't care about your business because they're just so far away from it, and that makes them impotent in terms of providing value to your business.
And those are fighting words, Robert. Impotent.
I know, but that's
I didn't
experience.
think we'd go there today.
It's experience there, but the difference I do see with GBS leaders who really are passionate about the business, they're able to translate their functional expertise into competitive advantage. And if you get to that point, you're really in the sweet zone.
Yeah, I'll build on this a little bit, Robert. You stated a very solid point, and I'll maybe make a pointed comment here. GBS leaders tend to get very passionate about cost, quality, etc. And your business, particularly on the revenue side, let me be direct. They don't give a blank, about those elements. What they care about is how did you help me meet my goals? Did you avoid out of stock situations? How quickly did you help me get the latest product to market? Okay. Are you able to hire the people that I want, when I want them, right? It's value. This is what I mean by value. And it's not the value that you think, right? So we go through this exercise where, when the company comes up with its plans, its vision, we basically link with it. So our mission is not standing on an island, it's all intertwined, including the words that we use to make it clear, that we are not on an island. I think the other point, which I have to even goes back to the, your earlier question, Deborah, we also have to look at ourselves. Very often than not, we tend to drink, you said it very well, we tend to drink our own Kool-Aid. Absolutely. And we walk around thinking that, hey, I had this template, it worked here, and I'm going to replicate the same thing here, right? And which is also why I think your other article is pretty astute. But, you're not going to last too long if you don't adapt. Right, just because it worked at brand name X, Y, and Z doesn't mean it's going to work at your current employer, right? You got to adapt because the company is not going to adapt to you.
That's right. I mean, there's too much. What I see sometimes in this market is that we use GBS jargon, and we think everyone should understand us. To your points, rather than we understand them. Yeah. We don't understand. We're a backbone for the organization. Yeah. We are not the organization. We are not the enterprise. And in order to maybe to make ourselves feel better, make ourselves feel more important, we forget that a good GBS is kind of like semi-firm tofu. And we're talking about impotency, and we might as well talk about tofu too, where we absorb the flavor of the company. We have a structure. We can help the organization stand up straight. We are a network, but ultimately we take on the flavor of, I hate tofu, by the way. We take on the flavor of whatever enterprise we're working within.
And to build on that, Deb, I think, by the way, I'm going to use that analogy. It might resonate, especially with my vegetarian friends. I do love my tofu, though. Is to build on that.
Has spices too, so we're
exactly. I mean, it's all about marinating with the right spices. Absolutely. Building on that fact, the importance of culture. I think that's specifically it's the business support, but it's also the culture of the company. Being in tune to that is super important, both for the GBS leader as well as the GBS organization. you work in a very people focused culture. The speed of things may be a little different, but taking everyone along on the journey is super important. I've seen quite a many GBS organizations that have tripped because, hey, my CEO has given me this target in terms of what I need to do. I'm going to deliver on that regardless of how many dead bodies I leave in my wake. Could work in some organizations that are very bottom line focused, and that is how they conduct business. Would not work in an organization that puts a lot of premium on people, taking people along on the journey. That's just important. And even if you deliver to that goal that was set out, you're not going to be a GBS organization that's going to thrive because it's just not a good cultural match. So seen quite a few careers go down the drain just on that particular count, the lack of good culture match.
Yeah.
No, really critical, really, really critical. And getting a GBS leader who understands that and understands where the organization is and the pace at which it can make change without breaking is difficult, because we all in this industry go to very sexy big brands, and we don't spend a lot of time understanding, are we the right fit? So that's something that the leader also needs to think about, because it's not just about the leader's career, it's about the GBS sustainability.
Correct.
And Deborah, I'm looking at some of the comments from our listeners coming in, and I'm paraphrasing one of the comments because part of it has already been covered. But just to ask some of you, you've been talking about what needs to be achieved. Can you also talk through a couple of simple things you did, or maybe they're not so simple to do, but basic things you did to actually achieve that? So, understanding power structure, important. Aligning with CEO agenda, important. But if there is a GBS leader who is struggling to do that, what are some basic steps they can take, whether it is in mindset, in day-to-day things they do to actually move in that direction?
And maybe, I think it's a great question. Maybe let me give a couple of hints and tips on how a GBS leader can try to become a better brand ambassador for GBS and ultimately become more relevant for the organization, right?
Mm-hmm.
And some really practical things that I think a GBS leader, any GBS leader can do, is show a deep interest in the business. For example, by going along a rep ride, spending the day with a sales rep and just really go in the market and understand how's the life of that rep, what is he or she struggling with, what are the customers struggling with, and spending a day to just really, really listen to ultimately those people in the organization who are in front of the customers, listen to the customers, and then take that back into the GBS team and say, look, this is everything I found. And trust me, you're going to find a lot of things that are very GBS relevant that at the moment are hindering the customer, are hindering the sales rep, and hence can be tremendously powerful if you then, as a follow-up, fix those things and improve those things. And an added benefit you get by doing something like that is as a brand ambassador, for you as a GBS leader to be seen, to be out there, to be interested in the market. That in itself is already a big premium, because you've left the office, you've got out there, you show a key interest in the market. Very simple thing to do, takes you a day. And I can assure you that if you ask the question of the rest of the organization, say, look, can I go along for a rep ride for a day? They'll love you for it. They really love you for it.
What are some of the challenges beyond the control of a GBS organization when it comes to sustainability? I mean, we talked about mergers, acquisitions, change of leadership, but are there other enterprise factors that affect the sustainability of a GBS? Not just, certainly, the business. There's a very famous case of a business that was carved out, and the numbers weren't being made. So the first thing they did was cut the GBS less than a year after they set it up, which is kind of an extreme example. But what else should a GBS leader look for that they can't control?
Be aware of your regulatory environment. The rules keep changing, especially in today's world, with the volatility that's going on around the world with conflicts, for example. That's changing things, just a particular example. But I would say that be in tune with, how the world is changing around you, particularly when it comes to legal reasons, because that will come out of nowhere. And then you got a very short time window to turn.
One concrete example of that, maybe, Jay, is any GBS organization that serves the business significantly present in China, and who has been providing service to China from abroad, or vice versa. That has radically changed over the last 2-3 years because of all the data loss. And we all had to learn that. We all had to sort of get used to that. But it's, guys, if you talk about an external factor that really shook the things up, this shook things up big time for the GBS industry.
Tanuja, any view? What's beyond the control of a GBS organization besides what we've already mentioned?
I think one thing I would say, in addition to everything that Jay and Robert mentioned, there is something that we just touched on a little bit in the beginning, which is the changing cycles of business, especially for businesses going through a downturn and a consistent downturn. Oftentimes that leads to a deep introspection within companies to say, hey, what are really truly the capabilities that we need in order to be prepared for the future? So sometimes, the capability analysis does reveal that, hey, we do need more of an investment in our front end. Our capabilities in, for example, sales and marketing are really the ones that are lacking. So no matter what the GBS organization can do from a middle and a back office, if my front office sales itself are struggling, it's not going to do me a whole lot of good. So then there is this very pragmatic decision to say, hey, I really need to invest in the capability in the front end. GBS, they've done a good job with it. It has enough momentum going for it. Objects in motion will continue to be in motion. And that goes back to, I think, what Robert was talking about. Sometimes, though, the GBS may be taken apart, but the capabilities continue to exist. So there could be a view, hey, that's going on a good trajectory. We don't need additional investment there. It will keep sustaining itself, but we really need to put the investment somewhere else, which could be in the front line of the business. I've seen that happen with organizations also. I do believe that becomes more of a short-term or a temporary thing, provided, of course, the company makes the turnaround. But that changing needs of where investment is needed, or the perception of where investment is needed, can also be a factor that would impact a GBS organization's journey.
Other comments?
Well,
let's look
building on Tanuja's comment, right? I think it is the sort of relative investment points you're making there, which is where does the enterprise invest more? Does the enterprise invest in GBS? Does the enterprise invest in R&D, in commercial, in supply chain? That's a big deal. And anybody like us who sort of lived in the corporate life and have dealt with budgets, it's always the question of who gets what budget, right? Where does the allocation go?
Especially if the business is struggling, right? Because there's no cash to be had.
Yeah, and there's always these sort of tough choices, and that's where you really have a tricky opportunity there as a GBS to say, how can I be at the front foot to embrace that new strategy, to embrace that struggle, and maybe in your example, say, can I start offering marketing services that make the investment of the company in marketing actually even more attractive than having to do it in a traditional fashion. And I think I see a lot of leading GBS teams who actually take that step forward and take advantage of the turbulent sort of external factors that are impacting the business. Say, look, let me try and ride this wave and make something more out of it.
Good point. Well, let's turn the tables a little bit. GBS organizations and their leaders screw up. Let's call it what it is. I'll throw out one thing that I've seen. When a GBS leader comes in, he or she doesn't necessarily respect the DNA. They bring in their tribe. Their tribe, predominantly folks from the outside, different tariffs, different ways of working. That it connotes, we're going to do this to you, not with you. So one of the things I see is a complete disregard for the DNA of the company, over-indexing on capability that may very rightly be found outside, but being separate and apart from the rest of the organization. What else do you see that, to be honest, leaders just don't get the memo?
They just don't listen. I mean, it's as simple as that. Like listen to the verbal, non-verbal, the corporate message. Especially for a new leader coming in, I think listening is the most important thing to be doing from your stakeholders, from your employees within the organization, your leaders within your GBS team, your supporting functions. I mean, listening is a very underestimated skill in my perspective. I think a good GBS leader has to be a good listener and reflecting on what you are listening to and then coming up with the right course of action to address it. And the one thing we haven't touched on so far, I don't know that it's a direct answer to what you're asking here, but customer experience, I think that is one factor that a GBS leader really needs to be tuned into. You may be doing great things on a cost front, you may be doing great things from value addition to the bottom line. If your customers are not happy, and by customers, I mean GBS customers, I don't mean like the final business customer, that matters too, but especially your GBS customer, if they are still not happy or wanting to do business with GBS, it just doesn't work. So staying tuned into that customer experience, in my perspective, is extremely critical, because if you do things all right but the customer's still not happy with you, it's not going to set you up for long-term success.
Other points of view here?
Yeah, I mean, look, when you go in new to an organization, you yourself are new, right? You're struggling. Let's be direct. You don't have a magic wand where you suddenly develop relationships. So you need to basically you're learning how to navigate the system. You're learning how to navigate the politics. You're still getting to know people. And if you bring in an entire lot of people, who are just like you're gonna struggle, right? So you need to have a blend. You need to bring the right balance, of people up front, but definitely you need to rely more heavily on people who know the organization, right? And not over-index what you said, Deborah. We know people in common, right, who basically over-indexed on that count, and they literally brought armies from friends, family from, I'm being silly,
Oh, it's a
but
tribe.
people
Let's face it, GBS is
of the
tribal.
tribe,
Yeah.
right? But it doesn't work that way. So you got to strike the right balance, and two, you got to bring the right cultural fit, because somebody with a cultural fit at company A that you worked at is likely not going to be a good cultural fit at your current company. So you also need to apply that judgment as well. I mean, I've definitely got a few lessons learned on that count.
Yeah, I think GBS leaders failing actually is not too different from business leaders in general failing in that sense. And I think Tanuja made the right point. Listening is such a key and underestimated skill. I mean, one of my first bosses told me, he said, the reason you got two ears and one mouth is so you can listen twice as much. And that was quite a pointed comment that I never forgot, actually. But it is so true. Listening is much more valuable than speaking. Because through listening you figure out what's needed, what's relevant, and you also figure out how you as a leader can develop yourself further. Because leadership is not a static thing. It's not like you're born a certain kind of leader. You're always developing as a leader, and you always want to be developing as a leader. And you can only develop if you listen to feedback, and if you really get more feedback. And as GBS leader, it's almost more important, because you're such a spider in the web in the middle of so many relationships. You got to be developing all the time and try to become a better version of yourself. And that's hard. That takes time. It takes continued investment. But I think it is probably the most important part of being a leader is to develop yourself and to develop your team all the time.
And we need to be very intentional about it, because, the tendencies tend to be, hey, let me focus on, building my capabilities, measuring what I'm doing, knock it out of the park in terms of the KPIs. Tending to be very internally focused is what our natural inclination of, especially if you've grown up through the ranks, which I have, that's where my natural strength is. That's where I'm going to naturally gravitate to. So I have to be a lot more intentional and deliberate, like even with my calendar management, to say, hey, don't lose sight of your stakeholder management. That is super important. Don't lose sight of your teams, which are remote. That's, again, very important, especially in the GBS world. So a great deal of intentionality on both of those fronts, especially on the stakeholder management piece, has been something that I've had to learn along the way. It wasn't something that I was naturally good at, but something that I've had to be very intentional about, and it reaps benefits when it's invested in.
Yeah, and I'd even take it up another level. If you think about GBS is a creature of the matrix. We're managing our teams. We're managing possibly third-party providers. We're managing the business. We're managing the top of the house. And where I see GBS organizations make missteps is they don't master managing the matrix. They don't understand that just stakeholder management alone isn't enough. You have to be able to orchestrate. Service delivery is part of it. One of the challenges I see is we've got GBS leaders who come in with big visions. They want to transform. But most GBS organizations spend an inordinate amount of time in what I call the repair cycle. There are 3 cycles to GBS. There's repair, reposition, and reimagine. It's fun to reimagine all the time. But if everybody's screaming because they're not getting their paycheck on time or they don't get a response about an invoice, that sinks the GBS. We still have to deliver. And as much as we like to think about aligning with the business, that noise, that constant repair cycle isn't doing GBS organizations any good.
And the best
index.
And I think on that point, stakeholder management is table stakes, but also think you need to be honest, because the reality is, to give you a rough number, right? Say you process 100,000 transactions, okay, a month, and you're at 99%, and you think you're pretty darn good, but just do the math. If you've 99% accuracy on 100,000 transactions, you still have 1,000 transactions, which means roughly 1,000 people are not happy with what they got. So you also need to be honest, that even at 99%, it's not all green. There is still room to improve. So you need to be, you need to build credibility. So if you go in and talk to your stakeholders and say, look at me, how great I am, I'm on green, you have no credibility. You lost credibility like this, right? But you need to be honest that, look, we have room to improve. Even at 99.9%, you still have 100 people, who are not going to be happy, right? It's a journey of improvement. And it's a journey of being honest with where you are, where you want to be, and making sure you understand that you're in lockstep with the business. It's not 2 different agendas. It's one agenda. And how do you help each other out?
Jay, I agree with that point. That there is that exception to be managed too. But at the same time, a corollary to the point you're making is also being able to tell your story and to control that narrative, to paint that picture, to say, hey, we are paying invoices 99% on time. And perfection comes at a cost, right? Because to get to that last 1% is exponentially more expensive than getting to that 99% range. And that is where use of external benchmarks is something that a good GBS leader would come in, because there's a cost to everything, right? But painting that overall picture also becomes important, to be able to control the narrative and say, hey, look at, yes, I get there is a pain point. We'll be looking to address it. But here's what an overall situation looks like. I think that is, again, something doesn't come naturally. I think we tend to focus on what went wrong, and just taking that time to even celebrate what is working right. And being able to tell that story is also important in terms of longevity of a GBS organization. I'm happy if you don't agree, we can have a discussion around it, but I do see oftentimes we lose focus on that.
I think you're right, Tanuja. I think it's important to put these things in perspective, and to know whether it's worth it for the organization to go from 99.9 to 100. Some organizations, it doesn't matter. But therefore, for me, the key KPI for a GBS organization is not so much the 99% or the 99.9%. It is the net promoter score, whether or not your key business stakeholders, your key business customers give you a positive net promoter score. And that is the ultimate indicator you should aim for, more so than the SLA, internal KPI, operational KPI stuff, because the customers don't really care about the operational KPI stuff, but they do have an opinion. And they're happy to share that opinion in a net promoter score question. And of course, that net promoter score question then is an invitation for a conversation to say, why do you think that I'm only worth a 6 on 1 to 10 instead of an 8, right? Tell me about that. What is not working for you? And from these conversations, you'll find the things that are actually blocking you. And you'll find the things that ultimately will become the undoing of a GBS if you're not careful.
Hey, so really enjoying the conversation, and over the last few minutes, especially, just a reminder to all our listeners today, you will see a link in the chat to register and a request for our reports on key issues for GBS leaders in 2024. So do take benefit of that offer as well. Let me ask one other question that I see from comments. While a lot of what you said is absolutely, spot on, GBS leaders also have a bias. When they come in, they have a bias for particular type of action or inaction. They also have a bias for
It's the same playbook, Rohit. We tend to use the same playbooks over and over,
right?
again.
But also, Deborah, they sometimes create inconsistency by favoring a particular way of doing things that comes from one site in the network versus other, or one group of leaders. So how can they get over their bias? How can they manage that and improve that connect between the GBS organization and the business? Because one, we are talking about their direct connect with their stakeholders, but let's face it, a lot of noise is created through all the leadership team that GBS leader manages and all the stakeholders that they work with, that leadership team works with. And how can GBS leaders improve that cultural integration to improve the longevity of GBS?
You're saying we are biased, Robert J. and me? No way.
Don't take it personally.
No, bias is the wrong word, Tanuja. Let's face it. After we've gone to different rodeos, we've been on the block a number of times. We all revert to a playbook that works for us. One of the challenges is we go into an organization with a playbook. Let's say we're in a growth organization. We're rebooting a GBS, and we have a playbook that seems to work. And then we go into another enterprise with different needs. We try to impose the same playbook, and it doesn't work. But there is a natural bias to using the same playbooks over and over and over again. That's why people hire you.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's more to leadership than the playbook there. I think good leaders are eclectic leaders. Good leaders know to use multiple playbooks. I wouldn't put ourselves in the category of...
agree, but I think we still need to understand that we all tend to use playbooks. I take your point absolutely. A good leader senses and knows when to use a playbook, but we all
and which playbook?
Yeah, we all.
No, absolutely. But again, that's. It's not a unique GBS leader issue. I mean, I see this with business leaders across my career. Some business leaders are more in tune with the reality and the context and what they need to do than others. I mean, that's just irrelevant. That's good leadership. But that's because good leadership, let's be honest, is the scarcest commodity on earth. There's an absolute scarcity of really good leaders. There's not many of those around. That's the hard reality. That's why leaders need to keep developing themselves to try and become better. And I put myself in that camp as well. I also still need to develop and become better.
And I think in addition to that, I would say, again, I'm going to go back to the point I made earlier. I think listening is critical, right? You have to listen with that open mind to say, yeah, this might have worked very well in my prior organization because it met the needs of that organization. But trying to fit a solution just because it works in that situation, it may not be solving the problem that needs to be solved in your current organization.
Yeah.
But really listening becomes critical, listening for where are those big problems that need to be solved. So you could place GBS in a position where those can be solved, right? So it's not about just bringing a solution to the table. It's about solving the problem on hand. So I'm going to go back to my point about listening. You've got to listen for where the pain points are and position GBS accordingly. Easier said than done. I'm not saying that I've mastered that art, but I think theoretically that is what should be happening.
Yeah. And if I can add to that, the reason why you need to listen is because the purpose of GBS is to enable the implementation of the company strategy. That's the ultimate purpose of GBS. There's no special GBS purpose other than you're there to help make the company strategy come through.
Yep.
And for you to do that, you need to really, really understand the business, understand the strategy. Otherwise, it's pretty hard.
Jay, we're honing in on what do GBS leaders need to do to promote sustainability. What do you think?
I
Got
think
2 votes for listening.
Yeah, I was listening and I was trying to figure out where do I chime in. But I think, look, this playbook thing is very interesting because I've never been a big fan of playbooks because let's be real, no two people are alike, no two organizations are alike, right? You need to have a framework which is flexible enough to adapt, to the company's culture. But, I mean, to give you a very concrete example, till I came here, every GBS I worked in, we were heavily using outsourcing. Okay, heavily, wherever, which BOT, hybrid, take your pick. Okay, at one point in time, I think we had the largest outsourcing deals ever signed with one of my former employers. When I came here, I very quickly discerned there is no way that model will work here. So that playbook doesn't work, right? And this thing, be curious, spend your time. In fact, I would say that if you, for a new leader, spend your time investing in your relationships, shake a lot of hands, kiss a lot of babies, essentially, right? Be curious, understand the culture. Robert, I love what you said because I did the same thing. Do your market visits, go on a sales call, visit the factory, but be curious, understand the culture, understand, what makes the organization tick, and then frankly adapt. We are all learning, along the way, and learn how the culture of the company works, and then figure out what's the right framework or the right playbook for that particular organization. But if you think you're gonna do your cookie cutter, what worked in A will work here, best of luck, buddy. That will be a very short turnaround time for you.
Well, one of the challenges is that the hiring officer hires based on playbooks. I've done this before, and doesn't necessarily understand that each culture in enterprise is very, very different. I'd add one more thing. I see leaders sometimes. GBS organizations become less sustainable when the GBS leader runs out of steam. We have folks in this industry who are very good transformers, but they don't like silent running. Silent running is just as hard as transformation. Making sure that you get up every day and you keep looking and you build not upon events and the ability to make major change, but you have to build upon, the daily drill. And that's a bit of a challenge. Energy, consistent energy, because GBS organizations do have life cycles.
Yeah.
They go up, they go down. As we talked about, they're subject to business exigencies, but also the leaders go up and down. And being able to either sustain or say, I'm not the right guy for this phase of a GBS is an honest thing to do too.
Absolutely. No, I totally agree. I think sometimes you're in a situation where you have to say, look, I'm a transformation person. I'm not a steady state person, so I'm going to move on. And that's perfectly fine.
And honest.
Yeah, you got to be honest about that. Because there's plenty of transformation to do elsewhere. It's a big world out there. It's a big world.
And
Right.
Deborah,
There's nothing worse than a GBS leader who's just not interested anymore.
Yeah.
And Deborah, you've triggered a thought. There are some organizations where the GBS organization becomes too much centered around the GBS leader. And if they leave, even on a positive note, the organization disintegrates. So anything on that, what causes that or what to do not to make that happen?
It's succession planning. And most GBS organizations don't do the job they should at succession planning. They just don't. They don't cross-train. They don't bring in talent from outside the GBS within the organization. It's just not something that's high on the agenda, and it's pretty critical. There are too many GBS leaders who are entirely charismatic.
Maybe two builds on that. One is succession planning, absolutely critical, and one tip I would give there is to promote your leadership for cross-functional moves. So if somebody's been working in IT, move that person into HR or into finance or into marketing or whatever. Right? Promote cross-functional moves, and that's the best way to develop rounded GBS leaders. And second, the sustainability of GBS shouldn't hinge on just the leaders and the succession planning. It should also be the capabilities that you embed in the organization, like process management, service management, sourcing management. Those things actually should be able, if created properly, to sustain itself beyond the life of a single leader, I hope.
Sounds good. I think we're at time. I'd like to thank Robert J. and Tanuja for a very lively and insightful conversation. I'm going to turn it back to Rohit for final words.
Thanks, Deborah. No, not much to say. I think thoroughly enjoyed the conversation myself, and I hope so did our listeners. Once again, Robert, Jay, Tanuja, thanks a lot. And Deborah, like always, thank you for your inputs and moderating this. One final reminder to everybody who's tuning in. You can use the link in the chat to request for a report on the key issues. And as you go through this video offline later, if you have any comments, questions, feel free to comment on this post, and some of the panel may look into your comments, or feel free to write to me with your questions and comments. Thank you, everyone, for dialing in. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.